Hi, I'm Bill Ulrich and I would like to welcome you to the Fire Jumper Academy. The training that follows includes Stage 2 modules for Identity Services Engine. We will cover messaging and positioning, demo, strategy and vision, and high-level design. These, combined with the Stealth Watch Stage 2 modules, will prepare you for the visibility and enforcement exam. Please use the table of contents on the left-hand side of this video to navigate to the different sections as required.
Hello everyone, my name is Dan Stotts. I'm going to be speaking today about the messaging portion of the Cisco Identity Services Engine training. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager for Cisco ISE, and today for our agenda we're going to be talking about the market opportunity associated with ISE, the solution value proposition overall, and key differentiating features associated with ISE, as well as a few customer stories and business outcomes. So from a market opportunity standpoint, the NAC market is really entering a renaissance or a period of significant growth. Unlike many product categories, NAC has been around for about 5+ years. Some would say it's been around for over 10 years through different iterations. But current market drivers are making NAC become much more important, specifically around IoT, the Internet of Things, mobility, and the general threat landscape that a NAC solution can address, and specifically around ISE. So overall, the NAC market is growing at a compound annual growth rate of 26%. And we're in a very strong position at Cisco with a majority of the market share at around 39%. And this is one of the big reasons why we're winning awards. The product itself is growing at a 30% growth rate year over year. And we're winning awards in terms of the Security Magazine, the Security Company Magazine in 2017. We won it in 2016 as well. Getting a lot of positive feedback associated with the improvements in simplicity and ease of use around the product in general. And then also Frost & Sullivan, again, for consecutive years has awarded ISE a large degree of the credit for innovation in the product category. And in addition, if there wasn't already a good reason to sell ISE to your customers to solve their most difficult network security problems, in general, we find that ISE is a strong force or driver when it comes to selling enterprise networking infrastructure, specifically routers and switches. And what we actually found was, after doing some significant research, that customers that sell, or rather that buy 100,000 of ISE and 100,000 of StealthWatch end up buying 11 times more networking infrastructure gear than they otherwise would if they did not have ISE or StealthWatch. 11 times per quarter, right? So you can see the opportunity, not just from an ISE StealthWatch standpoint, but from a pull-through standpoint for our enterprise networking to be significant. So great opportunity there as well. So here I'm going to just walk through the high-level value proposition associated with ISE. I talked about market drivers real quick. Overall, we're talking a lot about digitization. That's something that's on the minds of all our customers. And something that's been around for a while, though, is BYOD. It continues to be a market driver. Not all enterprises, especially since they can sometimes tend to be laggards in certain trends, have BYOD, or at least a true BYOD posture in their environment. Most of them probably do at this point have employees coming in with non-corporate devices that need access, right? And they're probably accommodating that, but there's not an official program for it. And that's definitely changing, and ISE is a big um, product they turn to when it comes to addressing that. IoT is really exploding at this point. It's been talked about for many years, but now it's really growing. And with all these devices coming on the network, it's really important that you protect them. And we're seeing a lot of breaches and a lot of issues and vulnerabilities, growing pains associated with IoT, and we have been for a while. Security is one of the biggest reasons why IoT hasn't matured as fast as a lot of people would think. And then finally, mobility. This kind of goes back a little bit to the BYOD, but specifically for employees that want to have access no matter where they are, right? They want to work from wherever they are, no matter, if they're on vacation or if they're home or at the customer site. They need to have access to our network to do so. So to do so as secure as possible is really, really important. So instant access anywhere, anytime, generally is the theme that or the value proposition that ISE really addresses. So what I'm going to talk about is, in terms of just general IT, how things are approached needs to change. Everybody recognizes that. And there's not only a security or market consideration when you think about the identity services engine, but there's definitely a IT operation component that really resonates with customers, we find. And that's just generally about efficiency, right? The ability to authenticate, secure, provide access, etc., to users with a minimal amount of IT intervention to make it streamlined and have a great customer experience. If you use the more manual, traditional means of doing what ISE does, it's a very expensive process. So what ISE definitely provides in general, and it's probably one of the few security products that that has this key value proposition, it's just more efficient to manage your network. And with all the devices that are coming online and connecting to the network, not just our phones, but our wearables, our IoT devices, many of which have vulnerabilities, you need to know that they're there so that you can address them, so that you can protect them. But if you don't know, you can't protect them, right? So what you really need at this point is a network and security infrastructure that embraces all the market trends I just mentioned. It has dynamic and adaptive network segmentation, and we'll talk more about that. One that doesn't sacrifice protection for agility, right? Make it be a business enabler for you. And the one that reacts to needs and understands business roles. So it's business focused as opposed to IT focused or endpoint focused, etc. So the general messaging around ISE is that it allows you to see and share rich user and device details, control all access throughout the network from one central location, whether it's a wired, wireless, or VPN environment, and then also has the ability to stop threats and contain them immediately. This is huge, right? Customers want to have the ability to not only detect threats, but they want to be able to contain them immediately, and that's what ISE provides. So ISE is really the linchpin of our security everywhere story. Many of our products, provide security for the data center, provide security for the campus or branch. That's really where ISE shines. It's scalability. We'll talk more about that, especially as it relates to competitors. But it's really important that you understand ISE is something that can scale like no other product, especially in NAC, but certainly within our security portfolio. And then it integrates and works in all the different environments to really enrich and improve your security posture across the network, from campus to branch to data center. Right now I'm going to be talking about features associated with ISE. Differentiating is a relative term, differentiating from other products in terms of our portfolio. as well as with other competitors, right, in the market. So things to think about. These are the key features to consider as we move forward. And to just outline what we're talking about, we're going to be talking about visibility. We're going to be talking about guest services. We're going to be talking about device administration. I'll be going in detail on each of these. Access control and BYOD and enterprise mobility. Right, visibility is key. This is one of the top considerations by most customers these days because they recognize with all the devices connecting on their network, they need to see what's going on and who's coming on, all the users, all the devices, IoT, mobile, etc. On top of that, what they generally see when they try to look for what's on the network, they get an IP address or they get fragmented pieces of information. One of the reasons why the Identity Services Engine is the Identity Services Engine is because as it authenticates users, it's able to pull in all this rich context associated with the IP address, such as Bob on his tablet in building 200 on the first floor, connecting at around 11 a.m. Eastern. He's connecting wirelessly. He's using these applications. He has this type of hardware. He has this OS, etc., so that we provide the right user, the right kind of device in the right place, granted the right level of access. ACS to ISE migration is happening in force, right? The access control system is a predecessor really to ISE for authentication control, but more importantly from a device administration standpoint because it supported a protocol that allowed administrators to control the configuration of network access devices. And we generally refer to this as device administration. The protocol to do so is called TACX Plus. Now, TACX Plus is something that was invented by Cisco, and it's something that we added to the Identity Services Engine about 2 years ago that allows ISE to be truly that central point of policy to control your network, the users and devices, as well as the network access devices on your network. So you get that single pane of glass, you get that simpler rollout device administration, right? And you're able to scale by having that central point of control. So when it comes to the migration from ACS to ISE, we're doing a number of things. We have promotions for the user, we have promotions for the partner, and we've also provided migration tools to make it as easy as possible for ACS customers to move from ACS to ISE. We've continued to innovate and provide product parity to make ISE an easy replacement for ACS. Something like 99% of all of the features and use cases associated with ACS now exist in ISE. So keep in mind when you're thinking about talking to your customers about network access, many of them already have ACS. Many of them already have it. It's a great upsell opportunity. It opens the door for you to not only talk about device administration, but all the other use cases that ISE provides to get a much more powerful access layer or access solution for your customers. Guest services is always one of the big starting points for a lot of customers. They're not always keen on starting immediately with like 802.1x or segmentation, some are, but generally, guest is one of the first introductions most customers have, and that's one of the reasons why we've really made sure the use case for guest is as robust as possible. We support 1 million guest accounts on a single instance. Guest access for everything for doing email, printers, SMSs, etc. And then the use cases within guest services itself, whether they sign up individually on a hotspot, it's a self-sponsored scenario where you have an employee that's sending the approval for the user to get online, or you have a sponsored guest account, right? So that you authorize sponsors to create accounts to share credentials. Control all access from one place is, somewhat subtle, somewhat obvious, but it's definitely one of the big differentiators for ISE. A lot of competitors can't do this. They can't do wired, wireless, and VPN from an authentication standpoint, all in the same instance, as well as expand that from a location standpoint, from headquarters to branch to remote user, okay? As well as the guest example that I talked about. You can do guest, you can do contractors, you can do partners, right? You can differentiate the level of access across all these different environments. Again, this is for scale. This is something our customers expect and need in this day and age. And then when it comes to AAA, right? The authentication, approval, and accounting of users coming online. The traditional, most secure gold standard way of which you should do that is 802.1x. But 802.1x is sometimes, depending on the customer, quite a laborious, difficult process to deploy. Conversely, ISE offers a flexible suite of secure access or authentication, or like I said, AAA approaches to dealing with the problem. Now, there's levels of security differentiation between all of the approaches, but the important point is that there's flexibility, whether it's passive ID, 802.1x, whether it's web auth, whether it's something as straightforward as just whitelisting, right? ISE has been around for a while. We've added all this functionality to do the scale and the flexibility that customers expect across different locations. So I talked a little bit about BYOD and the importance of our users not having access to what they shouldn't have, as well as the importance for IT to have a minimal amount of intervention in that process. So as your user coming on the network, right, it's going to profile the device. It's going to say you have a non-corporate device. Therefore, it's a BYOD device. And it's going to send you to a portal where you're going to enter your information, all of which is automated and streamlined. The IT professionals do not, touch or deal with that process at all. And then based on the information you enter, as well as your employee or user credentials, it's going to give you the right level of access. And it's going to be a great user experience. Differentiated access is something that is really important these days, especially as you consider threats and the ability to move laterally. I'll get to that in just a second. But generally, as a user comes to a location or to a or based on their user credentials, etc., there might be a different level of security access you want to provide that user to your network, right? So in this example, you have different types of users accessing the network in different ways, right? So if you have a doctor, right, who's probably a little bit more important type of user to the network on his laptop, he'll have access to everything, confidential patient records, hospital staff, intranet, hospital Wi-Fi. This is just an example. And then in addition, you might have a lab technician. She or he has slightly more limited access, so they would only have intranet or Wi-Fi access. And then you have a farmer representative who's typically not part of the company itself, not an employee, right? They're just visiting. So you want to make sure they just have a like a guest access, which would probably just give them access to the Wi-Fi. And what's important to mention here is that these individuals are based on tags, right? So, for example, if you were to take the doctor, right, the doctor role, and change him, instead of focusing on the laptop or the endpoint that the person's using, you're associating it with the role. So that if, for example, we wanted to give the doctor the same level of access to the lab technician, we simply change their role from doctor to lab technician, okay? And then they would have a more limited amount of access. Same could be said for the lab technician user. The lab technician user, maybe they get another degree, maybe they become the doctor. We change their tag so that they have more access, etc. But what's really cool about this tagging approach, right, is that as you tag certain users, based on the tag, users and devices, I should say, they only have a specific amount of access to those environments, right? So if you have a red tag, which is typically for, in this case, building management, and for example, one of those IoT devices gets breached, there's no lateral movement to the employee part of the network, or the printer part of the network, or the finance server part of the network. And as I mentioned, for any of those users or devices that we want to change their level of access, it's as simple as changing the tag that they're on, and then the network itself enforces that particular tag so that you have a central means by which you are segmenting your network. It's a much more efficient way to refresh, update, push policy, etc., especially as segmentation becomes that much more important as companies grow and they need to, for example, do a switch refresh. They need to acquire a company. They need to, just manage from an operational standpoint the users that are on their network, right? It's really, really not only important from a security standpoint, but it's also super important from a scalability standpoint, as well as just a simple cost standpoint. What you're doing here is you're not manually changing the enforcement capability at the switch or router level itself. You're making sure that you have the configuration for the switches and routers associated with specific tags, and then that gives you the flexibility to change the tags around for certain users. So likely everybody here hopefully has heard of software-defined access and the components of it, which are DNA Center, Network Data Platform, APIC-EM, and the Identity Services Engine. I just wanted to briefly touch on the importance of the Identity Services Engine when it comes to enabling DNA Center. Now, DNA Center is really that central console or that management console that you can use to design and enact policy that is then enabled through the Identity Services Engine. So it's just essentially an extra layer to give you that single pane of glass to manage your network. But without the Identity Services Engine, that whole access component of software-defined access, unfortunately, doesn't work. But on the other hand, we have the benefit here at Cisco to have a solution that's as robust as the Identity Services Engine to provide that very powerful capability in a centralized console that we call today the DNA Center. So I want to talk really briefly about some of the success stories and business outcomes and ways in general to think about selling ISE. So as you can see, the success stories and wins that we've had are pretty robust across the board. Belfius is a bank in Belgium. Essentially, they wanted to have the ability to have a pretty robust firewall and NGIPS solution. And one of the things they really liked about ISE is its ability to integrate with the firewall as well as IPS, so that when you have a security event, the firewall can alert ISE, which we call rapid threat containment, and ISE can change the policy immediately. How cool is that? And that's something that PAN or Checkpoint cannot replicate, right? So that was a huge competitive lockout, and that's why they went with our firewall, our IPS, and ISE in order to really extend the value of those respective solutions to provide an architecture that allows them to not only see and detect traffic or bad things, but also stop it immediately. In the case of Caterpillar, that was a big segmentation win. And what's so cool about that the deal was actually worth a lot more than $30 million. But rather, Caterpillar needed to have this software-defined segmentation approach to how they did their networking. In order to do that, they wanted to have TrustSec capable switches that allow for inline tagging, which is a much more efficient approach for doing this segmentation that I mentioned. And they bought the more expensive version of the Catalyst switches, which is an incremental increase of about $30 million just associated with this whole segmentation story. And then Cabela's, which is a sportsman outfitter, right, for hunting and fishing. They wanted an end-to-end architecture security posture, right? They wanted the full suite um, of our security infrastructure. And why ISE was so important for that is ISE integrates with everything. It integrates not only with our Cisco portfolio, our routers and switches, as well as our security portfolio, our firewall, etc. But you have the opportunity to upsell. Then you can also cross-sell. It works with third-party network access devices. It also works with, again, a lot of the other security solutions, whether it's Rapid7, whether it's Splunk, whether it's Tenable, etc. And then in order to do all this, it creates significant services opportunities. So our advanced services has a number of options, a number of programs and products that they sell along with ISE to make the customer successful using ISE. In addition, ISE has one of those robust partner networks to enable the deployments for ISE as well. But I want to end on a really good example of $1 million firewall opportunity at a healthcare customer that really exploded into a huge significant security opportunity with 2.7 million in firewall, IPS, ISE, StealthWatch, etc., and the associated services. But then they added a route switch refresh to it, which was another $9 million. So that was a 15x multiplier from the initial $1 million firewall opportunity. So what I encourage you to think about is as you're selling other products that integrate with ISE, what's a very effective strategy, right? And this is strategy as opposed to just simply selling the short-term easy sell is including ISE in the deal, because ISE not only integrates with the product that you're likely selling, but then once you get ISE in the account, you're adding value to ISE as well as the associated product for that symbiotic relationship. But then ISE integrates with a bunch of other solutions, infrastructure, equipment, etc. So you can really grow the deal significantly. Generally, how I recommend talking about ISE that I think is really effective is pitch the basics. Last thing the customer wants to hear is all the things ISE does. I just went through about at least 5 or 6 use cases to talk about. Any of them could apply, right? But typically we find that guest services is one of the big things that customers generally need and want initially. And we have a great solution for that. A lot of times it's 802.1x for regulatory reasons, etc. We have a great solution for that. For large enterprise customers or customers that are in industries that are heavily regulated, segmentation is a key focus. But start with the basics first. Start with an initial use case. Don't give them the whole kitchen sink so that they can get a taste. And then from there, there's a ton of upsell and cross-sell opportunities, as I mentioned. There's a lot of new things happening with ISE, right? I mentioned TACX Plus, the fact that we added that about 2 years ago. But in addition, we have a critical integration with the DNA Center that was recently announced at Cisco Live Vegas in 2017. We're an ACS replacement. ACS, again, as I mentioned, for device administration, has a large share of the device administration industry. So you want to take advantage of that. And then Easy Connect is a really easy way of deploying ISE, because a lot of customers are just scared, frankly, of doing 802.1x. So this gives you that secure access use case without the rigor of 802.1x. And then visibility in general, knowing what's on your network of the users and devices is a critical play. So the upsell opportunities I mentioned are ubiquitous from there. So pitch the basics, talk about what's new, and then you can do tons of upselling and cross-selling from there.
For this training, we'll be talking about how to understand ISE and the comparative landscape, specifically how analysts define the market category for ISE, how ISE has a specific market advantage,
And then we'll talk about how analysts have perspectives when it comes to ISE, how they test it, validation, value propositions, etc. around ISE. And then we're going to talk about the way you position it with customers. So depending on if it's a CISO, a network buyer, a security buyer, talking about the customer challenges, etc. And then as well, I'll spend a little bit of time on the advanced services use cases you might think about when considering selling ISE. So for the comparative landscape, generally, ISE works within the network access control category, which Gartner defines as technologies that enable organizations to implement policies for controlling access to corporate networks by devices such as the Internet of Things or by users. Network visibility and control continue to be drivers for the adoption of NAC. NAC's one of those categories that have been around for many years, at least 10. So it's gone back and forth in terms of its importance as a category. But today, NAC is really coming around. There's been a renaissance, if you will. And this has largely been pushed by the IoT market, the mobility market, and the general threats market, all of which are specifically addressed by the Identity Services Engine. In the messaging portion of this training, you should have learned about the high-level reasons why customers think about ISE, especially when it comes to the market dynamics, etc. If you don't remember, please go back. Regardless, you're going to be able to learn a little bit more in this section about why IoT mobility and threats are so important for ISE. But be that as it may, as you can imagine, for any of those categories, IoT, mobility, or threats, those are all becoming more and more important, right? As more devices connect to the network, specifically around IoT, but certainly mobility, it's important as well, including BYOD, bring your own device. I'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. And ISE itself, for those reasons, has been growing at over 30% year over year. So from a market advantage standpoint, we really think of ISE as a next-gen solution. And you can see in the awards it's recently won, pretty much for any award you can get around the NAC market, ISE wins because it's been around for a long time. We've had a lot of innovation going into it, and it's well positioned to be successful in these market trends, IoT, mobility, and threats, because of visibility, because of control, because of scalability and automation. I'll talk some more about that. So just to hit on this a little bit more, from a NAC standpoint, ISE is really the leader. It wins in almost every category it gets put into from a competitive standpoint, but then when you look at it comparatively to other competitors in the marketplace, ISE really has an advantage in that it's been around for a lot longer. We own the network, right? And a network access control solution has to work with the network in order to function properly. And because we own the network, we've had a NAC solution, ISE, for quite a while. We continue to innovate with it. That just means that we have more customers, we have first mover advantage, and we've been very successful no matter the analyst you're talking to. And that's also because we provide a lot of services for different use cases. And the visibility that you're able to get with all the connected devices that are coming online is critical in order to protect those devices and users that are accessing your network. For all the guests, contractors, or non-employees coming onto your network, you need to make sure that they're well segregated from the rest of your network so it's secure. Device administration generally is something that's really important because you need to control the administration of the network access devices on your network. And you need to be able to have a single central point in which you can provide access to your users, as well as the level of access they should have, whether it be to network assets or the administration of network access devices. And then generally with access control, you're providing segmented, segregated access based on policy to different parts of your network. This is extremely critical, especially when you think about segmentation and the likelihood that specific areas of your network could be breached. And if so, you need to make sure it's not a wide open network so that you don't have lateral movement to other parts of the network where your critical data is stored. Enterprise mobility and BYOD continue to be important, right? Especially in emerging markets where mobility still has strong growth. But be that as it may, the expectation is you have a BYOD strategy, you have a BYOD solution, and ISE is really that solution that allows you to onboard, get people the right level of access with minimal IT intervention, right? So you can lower your overhead, reduce costs, etc. So ISE connects the network. It connects the network devices, no matter the environment, whether it's the branch, the campus, the data center, or even the cloud. And that also includes SDN environments, your software-defined networking environments, or in the case of Cisco, our ACI architecture, right? You want to make sure that when you have policy, it's enforced across the network. It works with lots of different third-party network access devices, as well as security solutions. It integrates with our Cisco security solutions so that you can provide the context and visibility that it gathers to those other solutions so they can be enriched with the context ISE has. That's very, very valuable. As well, they can communicate with ISE to update policy based on the intelligence and information they're gathering. In the case of the firewall, you can tell if there's an endpoint or a security event associated with an endpoint, you can update the policy based on the security event from the firewall. With the network, if you have a visibility analytics tool such as StealthWatch, also StealthWatch can provide input and alerts to ISE so it can update policy accordingly. So the integration and the breadth of our portfolio, be it networking or security, and the fact that ISE integrates with these things makes it a very valuable tool to talk about architecture, to talk about integration, to talk about synergies that you can add value across the board with. And that's really how we win when we talk about ISE, as well as how we win when we talk about firewall or StealthWatch or the network or wireless, etc. The integration story that ISE presents for our cross-sell products gives us a solution that's unbeatable in the marketplace, especially when you consider all the different, especially in security, when you consider all the different point products that are out there. ISE's ability to work with our own security portfolio. So instead of going head-to-head with Palo Alto Networks, if we're talking about the firewall, you should talk about the firewall, working with ISE, getting context, sending alerts to ISE, updating policy. That's something that Palo Alto Networks cannot replicate. In addition, on the networking side, you're going to actually be using the network, right, to set up your policy and enforce your policy so that you have a segmented network. And it does that within the Cisco network better than anything else, making your network an enforcer for your policy and adding that additional value that a Huawei or a Juniper can't replicate. So you want to avoid those head-to-head bake-offs. They're time-intensive, they're expensive, they're resource-intensive, and it's not our strength, right? So you want to talk about ISE and how it can provide additional benefits to other solutions, as well as obviously the benefits that ISE provides itself. And by having this tightly integrated and automated approach to solving our customers' problems, again, that's something our competitors cannot replicate. Therefore, the ability to rip and replace or just replicate what we're doing is that much harder. From a product evaluation standpoint, it's really important to note that ISE has really been on the upswing when it comes to quality and the way in which they're looking at the quality of the product in general, right? From net promoter score to customer satisfaction to just querying the customers that we have so that they can determine the level of satisfaction, the customer experience, etc. You can also look at some of the ROI components. ISE is one of the very few solutions that provide some type of segmentation that allows you to easily manage your policy, and that reduces the costs associated with managing your policy significantly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about qualified customer stories that you should think about as you talk to your customers. First is around visibility. Visibility is extremely important given the number of devices connecting to the network, the number of attackers trying to infiltrate your network, and the fact that it's highly likely that there's going to be a time when these attackers are able to get into your network. So if you think about it, you need to have visibility on those devices because you can't protect them otherwise. You also can't have visibility on the traffic that those devices are generating. If you don't have visibility on it, you don't know what they're doing. So if you can't monitor their behavior, at the end of the day, security is generally a people problem. Devices do what the user tells it to do or the bad guy tells it to do. So you need to be able to see what's going on in order to determine if there's any negative or bad things happening for that endpoint. And then conversely, when you are able to see what's happening with that endpoint or that user, that IoT device, etc., that mobile device, you need to be able to do something with it. And that's one of the big things that ISE provides from a differentiation or value proposition. It's a central point in which you can control the level of access your network endpoints get or the level of access they get on your network. That's really critical because for a number of reasons. You only want certain people to have a certain level of access to your network, right? You only want the HR guy to have access to HR assets, or general assets that you get within the company. Same thing for the finance guy, same thing for the engineer, same thing for the marketer. Because the attack surface is growing. When you have all these endpoints that are connecting outside the corporate firewall, you need to be able to see what's happening and you need to be able to react immediately. So generally what I recommend when it comes to having a conversation with your customers about ISE, and let me just take a step back and point out the importance of talking about ISE, because once you get ISE in the account, it creates all these avenues from which you can pull in other products due to the integration story I talked about. Or you can sell ISE with other products at the same time to make that value proposition, be it with the firewall or the network or wireless, etc., that much more interesting for the customer. But generally, you want to start out and you want to start a conversation talking about which devices are connected onto your network. Have you had a breach, right? Oftentimes, the breach is associated with network devices, be they IoT devices, be they BYOD devices that were off the network firewall, and then they got breached, they were downloaded malware, etc., and then they were brought into the corporate firewall, and then they were able to laterally move, etc. But you need to know what's happening. This goes back to that visibility issue I talked about. And you have a process for detection, containment, and remediation, right? Who's in charge of those? Lots of times you'll have somebody within the networking area that'll be focused on getting people onboarded. Then you'll have another person that's focused on like the security side, seeing what's happening as far as malicious activity going on, security. A lot of times those people don't talk. You need to figure out who's who. But I guarantee you they want to collaborate when it comes to providing the right level of access, having visibility into any malicious activity that's happening, and then the ability to do something with it once you discover that there is a security event, right? That's really important because the security guy could find a security event, but then he has to go through all these hoops in order to change the policy for the user to give them a certain level of access or to kick them off the network, etc. If there were integration between the firewall and the identity services engine or your policy manager, etc., that would create a ton of synergies that would make the two products that much more valuable and get those two buyers or those two members of the organization to work much more closely. In general, most enterprise customers need an access control solution, primarily due to just the sheer number of devices that need to come online, the sheer number of employees that need to have access seamlessly and at scale. But if they don't have a network access control solution, I guarantee you that they're thinking about it, especially when you think about segmentation, because ISE provides that end-to-end segmentation and does so in a software-defined way using role-based access so that certain users have a certain level of access. That seems obvious, but it's not always something that's streamlined within an organization, and that's where ISE comes in, okay? So understanding their processes for network access control, and then understanding what are some of the problems they're facing in terms of access. And most often, there's a use case where ISE can fit in, but you have to understand what those use cases are, and obviously understand what the customer's problem is. So, any concerns associated with their network access, in addition to what I've already mentioned. But you want to pitch the basics. ISE does a lot of things. I mentioned visibility, I mentioned secure access, I mentioned device administration. You don't want to throw everything at the customer, because what we find is they get overwhelmed, they think it's going to be very expensive to deploy, and it's not. When you talk about the more simplified use cases that ISE provides, specifically guest, device administration, or secure access for wireless, you're able to get in the door much more quickly. Those are very frequented use cases that our customers have to deal with. So definitely make sure you're aware of the easy ways in which you can deploy ISE. We have lots of wizards and simple tools that will allow you to talk about ISE. Okay, ISE has been around for a long time. Oftentimes you need to talk to the customer about what's new. We've added a lot of new capabilities. Device administration wasn't even something that was offered a couple of years ago, but we added TACACS Plus, which is the protocol to enable device administration. Talk about that. Talk about most recently our integration with the DNA Center and how you can enact policy from a central location, as well as do assurance, network control, that means administration of the network itself from a central location, in addition to the policy component that ISE provides. But you have to have ISE in order to do policy with the DNA Center. We've added new simplified ways of managing, of administering the policies, etc. And then the upsell opportunities are ubiquitous. We'll have a section at the end of this, at the end of these slides that you can download, and you can see exactly how the licensing model works. But the important thing to take away from the licensing model is that there are lots of other ways that you can talk about ISE, whether it's posture, also known as compliance for the endpoint. There's profiling, which gives you that additional visibility that you can provide to other solutions in your network. There's always those opportunities for upsell. But start small, and then there's a lot of room to go big. And then the integration that it provides with other solutions is a huge factor in allowing you to sell those other solutions as well as derive additional value from ISE. Now, given the number of services that ISE provides to the customer, as well as the connection points that ISE has with your switches, your routers, your access points, your security solutions, etc., it's highly recommended for most customers that they buy a certain amount of implementation services so that they can do things like a readiness assessment. They can design the right approach for their network, and then they can test and implement. There's solutions across the board in our advanced services organization to enable ISE in the customer. But ISE is definitely not a toaster. It's not a set and forget. It's not something you just plug in. It's highly connected to your network. It's a major engine, right? The identity services engine for enabling your access fabric to work in a streamlined manner, in a centralized manner. And then there's predefined service offerings specifically for ISE, whether it's the design service where you want to just do some readiness assessments, where you want to do a proof of concept to look at what's the right approach for the customer. And then most recently, with our device administration functionality that we've added to ISE over the past couple of years, we're providing ways in which you can easily migrate over from the access control system, or ACS, over to ISE. And ACS has been end of life, so we want to make sure that it's as seamless as possible for our customers to do that migration.
Hello and welcome to the FireJumper program. My name is Eddie Mendonça. I am a security CSC in the GSSO Channel Engineering Organization. Today I will be walking through a short demo flow of ISE 2.1 context visibility and device profiling features. The delivery mechanism we will use for this demo is the ISE DNA, or Digital Network Architecture Always On demo. You could find this DNA demo on dCloud. We're logged in here as an admin, and we're looking at the new homepage dashboard in ISE 2.1. You could see, if you have experience with prior versions of ISE, that this has been revamped and it looks a lot cleaner. In addition, these widgets are customizable. You can go ahead and close the ones you're not interested in and create new ones via this gear at the top, add dashlet. You can even add a whole new dashboard. And by dashboard, I mean you can see that this homepage has 5 dashboards: summary, endpoint, guest, vulnerability, and threat. You can create your own by clicking this plus sign or going add new dashboard here, and you can define your own custom. Let's go ahead and do that. You can define your own dashlet that you want to see in this custom dashboard. And typically you want to pick 5 or 6 because that real estate fits nicely on the screen. And there you are. And this custom dashboard is persisted in your user account, not necessarily in like a browser cookie. So you can log out and back in a different browser, a different machine, and you would still see it. Okay, that's a quick little overview of the homepage dashboard. Let's dig into context visibility. So context visibility is a new feature in ISE 2.1 that provides for a centralized view of endpoint and authentication data, and it also allows for you to do quick navigation of this data. It's a very good tool for doing network investigations or forensics. What you can do is use these dashlets across the top to filter, and then this table down here will actually update based on what you have filtered. For instance, if I go into endpoint classification and I want to filter on a given profiled endpoint type, I can do that by just clicking within this widget. For instance, if I click mobile devices, then these graphs update to only show mobile devices. And in there I can specify only Apple mobile devices. And now what I'm left with is a filtered view of only Apple mobile devices. And the filters that I've chosen show up here as breadcrumbs that I can close or modify accordingly. The other really nice thing about this feature is that you can perform actions on your filtered data. As an example, if I wanted to send a change of authorization to this endpoint, I can do so just by clicking this menu and choosing port bounce or whatever it is I want to send to it. Other thing you could do is, let me select the endpoint again, is if you had MDM integrations, you could send an MDM action such as a pin lock or device wipe. Okay, did also want to point out that these are built-in views into context visibility. You could create your own. We have views for BYOD, compliance, authentication, compromised endpoint and vulnerable endpoint, it's important to point out that you'll see data there if you have those integrations with threat-centric NAC. So Qualys is the third-party tool that we use for providing vulnerable endpoint information, and our own AMP product is what we integrate for compromised endpoints. You could create your own custom view in context visibility by just selecting Create New, give it a name, and then you can select your attributes. I'm going to cancel out there. Okay, now that's a quick little overview of homepage dashboards and context visibility. Let's dig into the feature in ISE that feeds all this data, which is our profiling engine. You can find the profiling configuration under the Work Center tab, just like all these other work centers. Just go to Profiler. Okay, we are looking at the Profiler Work Center now. As with other work centers in ISE, we have the settings conveniently separated into Prepare, Define, and Go Live. Now, the nice thing about Profiler is it works out of the box. You don't really need to tweak anything if you want to start profiling endpoints. You only need to make some changes in here if you want to customize the behavior. As an example, if you want your profiling engine to be able to define authorization policy based on a profiling rule, then you're going to want to turn on this change of authorization setting, okay? Right, by default, the COA type is off, or no COA. You're going to want to set that to re-auth so that when an endpoint is correctly profiled, if you have an authorization rule for that endpoint, you can send a COA to the endpoint so that it comes back in and falls into the correct authorization rule. The other settings that you might change from the defaults are the probe configuration. So that's defined in the deployment page. If you go into the nodes config by clicking the node, you'll see all of the services that are enabled on this node, and you can see Profiler is enabled by default. But what we're interested in is the profiling probe config, which is configured in this other tab here. So if you click Profiling Configuration, you'll see that these protocols are enabled for getting probe information. We definitely want to turn on HTTP because there is a lot of valuable information, and Radius. I'm surprised Radius is turned off. So Radius is normally turned on by default, so somebody must have turned it off. HTTP and Radius are very useful for gleaning information about the endpoint. Radius, that's where the network access device is sending this data that it receives from the endpoint via device sensor feature in either iOS or the wireless LAN controller, and it sends that to ISE via Radius. And the HTTP data, that's where a device is redirected to ISE directly via like a central web auth or a BYOD. Then you can get HTTP information from the endpoint to help categorize it. So those are the two settings that we typically will change in a profiler configuration: the probes and the COA settings. Back to the overview. The next thing we may want to change are the profiling policies. So let's take a quick look at the rich set of profiling policies that are built into ISE. These policies really define how ISE can classify endpoints. You can see that this Always On demo has 790 built-in profiling policies. Okay, typically on a new ISE deployment, you'd see 512. The reason there's 790 is there's 250 plus healthcare device profiles that were added to this Always On demo. That's why you see all these healthcare devices. Okay, so you could view these, you could filter them with this filter. I'll just type in Apple here to see my Apple devices. You could also use this tree view to see the same profiling policies in a nice little tree view. It's hierarchical. You know, some of these profiling policies are parented from others, like, you know, Android's a parent that has all the Android devices, or the profiles, I should say, under it. What you could do, it's typical, is you know, let's say that you wanted to create a custom profile. Let's say you wanted a profile that was specific to iPad Airs, okay? Not just iPads, iPad Airs. So what you could do is you could just take the existing Apple iPad profile policy and duplicate it and call it an iPad Air. We're going to cancel that. We don't want to change anything on the Always On demo, but that's how you would do it. Oh, that's loading. Let's minimize this. So you can see it just adds a copy to it. You would change it, and then you can actually change the policy element rule that defines how it profiles an iPad to only profile an iPad Air. But I'm going to go ahead and click cancel there. We want to also discuss this logical profile feature. These are built-in logical profile, and the name kind of self-explanatory. These are a set of profiles that fall under a category, and that category is what we call a logical profile. These are built in. You can create your own, but these logical profiles are very convenient when it comes to creating authorization policy based on device type. For instance, printers, you may want to create an authorization policy that gives printers only access that printers need. So in that case, you don't want to have to go through every one of these 700 policies to find all the printers, right? You can just use this logical profile. So you have one rule, it has all printers in it. All right, back to overview. Let's see what else we want to cover. We talked about authorization policy. Let's take a quick look at the authorization policy. Most of these authorization rules are built into ISE. A few of them I can tell by, this is the Always On demo, so they've been added. But you can see we do have some authorization rules that are using Profiler. For example, if a device gets profiled as printer, then we want to give a printer access. Okay. Back to the Work Center. Lastly, we want to cover reporting. So much like all the other features in ISE, you're going to see a reporting or go live auditing and monitoring section that allows you to run reports. So you could do that right through here. If you do it through here, it's nice. You're only going to see the profiling reports available here. These are all related to profiling. If you went through operations reports, you'd see everything, which is worth showing because you can always drill down and see only the profiling reports. They're under endpoints here. Here's profile summary. So let's go ahead and run the profiled endpoint summary report for yesterday and see what we get. All right, these are all of the endpoints that have logged into the network that fell into some type of endpoint profile. And you can take this report, it's like it has 98 rows, and export it to PDF or CSV, whatever suits your needs. Let's go back to the Profiling Work Center. I believe that covers it. This concludes the ISE visibility and profiling short demo flow. Thank you for your time.
My name is Yuval Shchori. I run the product management team for ISE, part of Security Policy and Access. Together with me in the room and in other buildings in San Jose and in different areas of the U.S. are both PMEs and product managers of the product. So if you have any questions about what I'm talking about or other stuff, feel free to just throw the questions at the WebEx and you'll get plenty of answers. The things that I would like to focus today, probably not new if you already seen my, for example, my last update. Things didn't change from a market perspective. Customers are very much focused on first visibility, then control. Tell me what's in my network. Tell me where it is. Tell me what it's doing. Tell me what type is it, so I can understand how can I control it. And only then I'll be able to decide on the policy. I'll decide what I'm going to do. Especially with IoT becoming a real reality, not like, reality, yes, I'm thinking about this, but customers are actually saying, yes, I'm starting to see IoT in my network. Some customers of mine refer to it as Internet of Trash, mainly because, you know, it's something I'm saying quite a lot these last weeks in multiple presentations. You know, if you take a look at what's going to be connected to the network, things like, for example, light bulbs and other stuff which are really simple, they cost not a lot of money. And now that when you take a regular light bulb and you make it an IoT-enabled light bulb, you actually need to connect a computer to it, and you need to connect a wireless interface to it, and still it needs to stay competitive. So you can't charge $50 for a bulb that, you know, without the IoT attached to it, or the IoT smartness or awesomeness, costs $1 or $1.50. It has to be very simple, very cheap computer, and also the wireless interface is going to be very simple, right? What does this mean? It means that we have more vectors of attack on the network. It is not going to be smart enough to, you know, protect the network. It is going to be as dumb as hell, and you better believe that there are going to be enough hackers trying to hack networks through IoT devices. Not that it did not happen. If you heard about the DNS attack, what, I think last year, I think it was September of last year, right, where half of the internet was down, but OpenDNS, that was, I think, one of the only DNS systems that was not taken down by this attack. It was due to, you can call it IoT or not, it was IP-enabled cameras, home security systems, right? Not different from everything and anything that your customers are going to put in their network. So again, they want to know exactly what's connected. Wireless is not making it any simple or any easier on them to understand what's connected to the network. And if you haven't heard yet about the new vulnerabilities they found this morning with WPA2, at first they thought it was WPA2 PSK, and then everybody said, yeah, I don't care about that, it's only for home users. And then they, you know, reading again the article, you understand it's the WPA protocol, regardless of are you using PSK or enterprise, all right? So you can't protect what you can't see. You want to be able to understand what's going to attack you, right? This is one thing that I'm going to give you a couple of updates on with regards to that. And one of the things when we talk about both visibility and control, we have multiple discussions with customers that almost amaze us in how critical ISE has become in the recent, I would say, several years, to maybe a little bit more to customers. And you get it not because customers are saying that, but because when you delve into the asks, the new features, the requirements that we need to abide to, you understand that we're talking about something that is really, really serious, really important in the network. And we're talking about scalability requirements that we never were asked to deliver, and resiliency requirements, you know, we still have good resiliency options like, you know, critical VLANs and critical ACLs, but customers want more. Customers want that even when the PSN is, you know, can't connect to the PAN because the WAN link is down, they want the experience to be the same. They don't want to give away security. They want the experience to be the same and still maintain the same level of security. So we're going to talk about mainly around these areas, about, you know, providing more visibility into what's connected to the network and how do we better control it, and also what are we doing in order to make the entire deployment, the entire system more resilient and more scalable. So what's in the release? So first, I hope that you know, we have started what we refer to as the road to posture NG, to next generation posture. You probably know that you have to have, you know, something next generation with your product, or else it doesn't mean anything to anyone. I always ask myself, like, what comes after next generation? It's kind of, you know, it's kind of a vicious circle. But if you take a look at after the immense changes we introduced to posture, last two releases, let's look what we're planning in 2.4. So first, we need to, I would say, better behave with end users. I was a CISO back in 2000, and when I was a CISO back then, the way to measure a good or strong, I should say, CISO was CISO was how much was he hated. If you were really hated, you're a good, strong CISO because you're guarding the fortress. Today, CISOs are very much concerned about end users complaining about them, and we see it again in the requirements we get. If once, the questions were, I want you to not allow anyone in my network if they're not 100% compliant with posture, today the requirement is, if they're not compliant, give them a grace period. So let them in and let's hope they will repent and, update their antivirus, et cetera, right? This is what we're seeing, and we'll talk about this. Customer want, first, more flexibility. They want to be able to be more flexible, provide, again, end users with more flexibility, and they also want to see faster value when they start POVs. And it's also, I think, it's very much relevant especially when I'm standing in front of you guys who are our partners. You also want to make sure that when you go into an ISE POV, you get the maximum volume the maximum value in the minimum investment of time. And also, when we compete with Forescout, it's sometimes, funny to hear what they're taunting, and sometimes it's kind of alarming to see that customers really buy it. I don't know if you know, Forescout went and they're now they have submitted what's called a SEC filing, an S1 filing. It's funny to see, that I was expecting them to talk about, tens of thousands of customers. They are reporting around 2,500 only, although they're making quite a lot of noise in the market. And I can tell you that from a perspective, right, of kind of where are we coming, we are at least, well, I can't talk about numbers, but we're not in the same ballpark in terms of customers, right? But still, every customer that's met Forescout, what do they say? You can get posture without an agent, which is a nice POV story. We know that in a production network, I never managed to find even a single customer that is running production and is running without an agent. With Forescout running, but it doesn't matter because it makes the sale, right? And eventually we're all interested in also making the sale. So what are we doing as part of 2.4? One warning that I should give you guys: if you see the work in progress here, you should understand this is work in progress. ISE 2.4 is still being coded, right? From a timeline perspective, probably if this was, maybe 2 months out, this session would have been easier because, everything was either out or ready to be shipped. But what you're seeing here is really sometimes it's mock-ups, it's not, it might change, right? Actually, even if you don't see work in progress and you see screens, it might change. Most of what you're going to see today are mock-ups. But anyhow, with what we refer to as the visibility wizard, starting 2.4, we're going to introduce the ability to scan for posture. So whenever you're adding an address range, if under posture you're going to check include range, what the machine is going to do, what ISE is going to do, it is going to try via PSExec to use an agentless mechanism, or actually using PSExec, which is a WMI mechanism to run something on the machine. We're actually going to run an exe file on the machine that's going to get the inventory for us and then dissolve and disappear, right? And then everything is going to be in ISE without the need to install an agent, right? So from a check the box perspective, yes, we are agentless, right? Will you see that running in production? Definitely not. It does not scale. It has so many limitations that you do not want to run it in production. And again, it's a technology thing. It's not an ISE or a Cisco thing. What else? I talked about grace period. So here what you could do, you could actually provide up to 30 days of grace to an incompliant or non-compliant end user, meaning that even if you are not compliant, I'm going to allow you to get into the network, and I'm going to present a pop-up that says you're non-compliant. However, since we're a really nice security team, we decided to allow you access, but please, pretty please fix the problem. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing that we're allowing is to cache the last known posture status, meaning that if we know that your machine was already postured, we can cache the state and we don't need to validate you. And in any case, we're going to provide you with a customizable message. That's the message that is going to be presented when someone non-compliant is authenticated to the network, right? So you're not compliant but has been granted short-term access, short-term being up to 30 days. It kind of freaks me out when we know that worms just swarm in a network after 5 minutes, but these are customer requirements. And when this short-term time had expired, actually this is going to be again a customized message that customers will be able to change and use whatever they want to make sure that the end user do whatever they want. Scalability. So again, we talked about IoT. It doesn't matter to which analyst you believe. It doesn't matter if you think that by 2030 there are going to be 500 billion devices connected to the network, which is a Cisco number, or it's a 300 billion number, or maybe it's only 100. It's kind of an insert your favorite analyst number here. It doesn't matter. It's a huge number, and some of this number is going to be within your customers' networks, and they want to be ready, right? So when we talk about ISE, what we refer to as an ISE cube, an ISE deployment, where you can only support up to 500,000 concurrent sessions, there are large enterprises that say this is not enough, we need more, all right? So what we're tracking is upping this number. I'll give you some numbers in a second. We need more resiliency. We talked about this, right? We can't have a branch disconnected because the WAN is down, right? They want to be able to, either continue local processing. Think of a branch of a bank, right? We don't want to lose everything we do just before the WAN got down. We want to make sure that we still provide networking access. And also we need to remember that there are some architectural limitations, such as the amount of PSNs, the amount of endpoints per PSN and per cube, and also limitations such as the maximum round trip time between a PSN and PAN and MNT. And also we see large customers, usually from a functional perspective, not only, in most cases it's a functional perspective. It's not really like a scaling thing. They run multiple cubes, or they run what we refer to as an ISE tray, or an ISE cube tray, right? For example, think of a bank. They have one ISE cube for their administrative network and one ISE cube for their financial ATM, teller machines, et cetera, network, right? That's a functional requirement. MODs, DODs kind of work the same. They like to differentiate between networks, right? From a seller perspective, this is you. Sometimes it's hard to sell into a large space because of these architectural limitations. Sometimes, customers are asking you, okay, how am I ready for IoT, right? And you would like to have a better answer, and that's exactly what we're working on. So phase one for what we refer to as super scaling, ISE 2.4. Again, I am warning you, everything you see here is actually a number, a target number, what we track. We could have either tell you and then kill you all, or just warn you. We decided to go with just warning you. This is still like internal numbers, all right? We're tracking 2 million endpoints, This is what we want to deliver, right? Per ice cube, 4 times higher, okay? We're talking about the ability to run the live logs and the reports much faster. We're talking about differences that when I saw the differences, I was actually a bit embarrassed about our current performance. So things that take 6 minutes are supposed to take less than half a minute or 10 seconds. All right, we're talking about things at a level of improvement that you're going to notice the second you're running the machine. All right. Another thing is the creation of clusters, where you can actually create PSN clusters that manage attributes only for endpoints that are connected to this specific cluster. And the information today, every time that something or someone is connected to the network through a PSN, the PSN sends information to the PAN, to the MNT, right? And until there's an ACK process, and of course, everything that happens needs to go through the MNT. What we're doing now is actually limiting, in a way, we're limiting information to be partially shared only within the PSN cluster, and then sharing some information with the PAN and MNT. So in this way, actually, even if you lose the WAN connectivity, it's still working. Even if you lose one PSN, all the rest of the PSNs in the cluster still share the information, and they know exactly what's happening. And again, it's kind of any PSN can manage any endpoint, right? Again, because it's part of the same cluster. And we're going to see some diminished requirements on latency. So we're going to allow a higher number on latency. We don't have the numbers on this front yet. Even if your customers don't need too many endpoints, they're going to see improvement because of the live log, because of the reporting, because of the survivability. Right? They're going to see every ISE customer that upgrades, migrates to 2.4 is going to see benefits here. All right, but what about ISE trays? What about multiple ISE deployments, right? When you want to, for example, do some policy auditing, it's a labor-intensive process. You need the ISE admin to sit together with the auditor and go line by line, right? If you want to migrate from lab to staging to production, it's a manual process. Manual means prone to error. If you want to take a production system and kind of copy it into a lab environment, again, labor intensive. Who installed here more than 20 ISE deployments in his life? More than 50? All right, now think that the 51st or the 21st or even the 3rd is going to probably require you doing the same thing that you did in the first, because after the 3rd time, you kind of have your own best practice, right? It requires time, it requires kind of recurring labor, right? And if you have your own kind of, internal best practices, then it requires manual configuration, okay? I think you all know what I'm going to talk about, right? Ideas? Nothing? All right. Wow. Hard, that your audience hard to work with. All right, export and import. We're not only capable of exporting the policies, we're actually capable also of importing it with ISE 2.4. All right, thank you. At least I got some applause on one side of the room. The ability to, of course, encrypt it if you want to send it. All right, send it over email, download to the machine, et cetera, et cetera. The caveat here that it's only for authentication objects, authentication and authorization. All right, so only for auth objects, which is 90%, 95% of the policies that we see, and only for Active Directory, which is again around 97% of our customers, 95% of our customers. All right, so yes, we still have some gaps to fill, but for us it was important to solve, 95% of the problem and help you guys. When you go to install a new ISE 2.4 deployment, you can actually do it with, just install a fresh deployment and then import your kind of favorite best practice configuration. All right? When importing, you can overwrite existing data, for example, in a lab that you want to kind of imitate a specific deployment, or when you're done with the lab, you want to export from it and import it into the existing production area, and then you don't want to export it. You actually want to kind of merge with what's happening. IoT, we talked about IoT, so ISE is a prominent part of Cisco's both security and enterprise networking IoT strategy. The first phase, we're announcing the first phase here. We're allowing to provide more visibility and also look into how do we deal with more complex configuration and more complex networks. I think that another thing that we see in the IoT space is that the people that deal with the IoT technology itself, they may be, great electricians or great elevator people or great, air conditioning people, but they do not understand anything about networking, and security, and we need to kind of cover up for that. I think that Cisco is doing quite a good job around this in certain areas, and that's exactly where we're integrating. And also, we want to make sure that you guys understand that this is only part, right? There is a cohesive message that we're building now, and this is just the first step in the journey that we're going to be taking our customers through from an IoT perspective, all right? So first thing, we're going to integrate with Cisco IND, Industrial Networks Director. It's a Cisco management system that manages mainly what's referred to as OT technologies, OT operational technology. This is like, manufacturing lines, et cetera, et cetera. So Cisco IND has visibility into what's connected to the OT network, and then actually it publishes into ISE through PXGrid, and then we can share it with StealthWatch. You can have just visibility into what you have in your network. So again, more visibility into what you have in the network, even when it's managed through a Cisco IND. You will see more IoT-like management systems that interconnect with ISE, because not always you want just to profile. Sometimes you just want someone else to tell you, yeah, I know this sensor, I know this, light bulb or whatever. You don't need to start profiling it. It's much more optimized when you get it from someone else. TrustSec. Again, from a scalability perspective, customers ask more for TrustSec. They want to be able to, A, control the way that they deploy TrustSec configuration, especially when it comes to IP2SGT mappings, and B, they want to understand and validate that what they did is relevant. And also from a deployment perspective, us as sellers, you as the people that actually deploy it, you want to make sure that you validate the deployment as you go. That's exactly what we're doing with ISE 2.4. So first, we now support 10,000 FGTs in ISE to support just larger deployments, and also we can selectively define which IP2SGT mapping we actually want to deploy. So if you have an IP2SGT mapping that is relevant for a specific region, for example, I will be able to deploy just to this region, and I don't have to disrupt anybody that's currently, in the middle of their working day, and now, which is still middle of the night in Europe, I can, for example, deploy to my European systems or deploy my European SGTs, right? And replace European with, campus versus data center, data production versus lab, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing is the ability to validate deployments. For those of you who deployed, who has here experience with TrustSec deployments? Good. So as you probably know, when you make changes, you have to push, the configuration to the network, and it's kind of, you just have to hope that everything goes well. That's exactly what we're doing with the validation. The thing that works is actually when you push that button, which is deploy, it actually sends COA to all of the devices that are affected, and it does not send the actual configuration change, but instead it tells these devices there's new configuration, come get it. Okay, but you don't know exactly, when did they get it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's exactly what the validate deployment is doing. Eventually what it's going to do, and you can actually configure it to run automatic verification X amount of minutes after deployment. It is going to look into what's there, what's configured, et cetera, et cetera. All right? That's the idea. So you can actually get and understand how is your deployment doing. From a profile, one last thing that I forgot. Yeah, I forgot. It was on this slide, and I mistakenly deleted it. TrustTech now support IP version 6 mapping into SGTs. All right? We have tons of customers asking for IP version 6. It's already not like you have to put it on your RFP answer so we can checkbox something, but actually customers say, unless you are delivering this, we cannot allow you in our network because we're already running IP version 6. All right? So we support IP version 6 for SGT mappings, and we're going to, with 2.4, and we're also going to support Radius for IP version 6. StackX Plus is already supported. Radius over IP version 6 is also going to be supported. Positioning, a lot of questions around when do I position SDA with ISE, when do I position only ISE? It's very simple. If the customer is sold on Fabric, if the customer is sold on context sharing with assurance, if they already look into Cat9K, if they need multiple VNs, if you're thinking with, either your EN peer, right, within the organization or with the ENSC of Cisco, and it seems like the right thing, that's what you need to position. But again, remember, you need to sell what's on the truck. If the customer requirements are not being answered, but what's currently part of SDA, feel free to sell only ISE because it's going to serve you even when the customer migrates to SDA. All right?
Hello everyone, my name is Tim Abbott and I'm a technical marketing engineer with Cisco. In this session, I'm going to cover design concepts of Cisco Identity Services Engine. The learning objectives for this session are going to include design use cases. We're going to talk about design considerations for deployments of ISE. We're going to talk about the details of ISE deployments to include sizing, and then we're going to wrap up the session talking about associated advanced services. There are 3 design use cases that I want to focus on in this session: network, mobility, and security. And of those categories, we're going to focus on visibility, access control, guest services, BYOD, and lastly, under security, we're going to talk about threat-centric NAC as well as rapid threat containment. To understand visibility with ISE, you also need to understand profiling with ISE. ISE has the ability to learn what endpoints are connected to the network. With ISE, we can support up to 1.5 million endpoints that can be stored into the database, each of those containing 50 attributes. There are 550 plus profile policies that are included by default when you install the software. We also have the ability to provide a feed service so you can get a continuous update of new policies that come out, such as the latest and greatest iPhone or Android device. We also have some 250 plus medical NAC devices as well. So for the medical vertical, you can also include these profiles to assist with hospitals in identifying medical specific devices. When we talk about profiling, we also need to understand what type of probes we have. When I talk about a probe, it is in reference to a method in which ISE learns about a device. Some of the probes that we have include NetFlow, DHCP, DNS, HTTP, Radius, Nmap, and SNMP. There are a number of different attributes that each one of these probes provide, and once we collect a number of attributes, we're able to finally paint a picture of what that device is on the network. In addition to device profiling, ISE also has a feature called the Visibility Setup Wizard. This wizard allows customers to quickly learn what endpoints are on their network. This can be launched right from the dashboard by clicking the Launch Visibility Setup wizard icon from the dropdown. It's five easy steps. It also allows customers to not only learn endpoint information, but it also allows them to discover network devices as well as join Active Directory at the same time. This wizard, however, is only available in standalone deployments only. To launch the wizard, we click on the dropdown and then we're immediately set up into step one. Step one basically is learning how to find endpoints on the network. What we do first is we go ahead and input our IP address ranges that we want ISE to look for endpoints on. We have the ability to select whether we want to do active or passive scanning. Active scanning uses Nmap, so if you have customers that are sensitive to Nmap scans around the network, you might want to uncheck these boxes. The next step is to discover network devices. Similar to discovering endpoints, what we do is we go ahead and add a management IP address range for network devices on a customer network. Once we go ahead and input that information, ISE using SNMP will go out and pull that subnet to learn the network device information. The last step of the Visibility Setup Wizard is connecting to Active Directory. Again, this is optional, but it does help the Active Directory probe learn information about endpoints. What we do is we give it some information, we give it a display name for visibility in ISE when we need to modify this configuration later. We enter the fully qualified domain name, we select the node that we want to join Active Directory, we enter administrative credentials, and then what we can do finally is then test the connection to Active Directory. If we need to, we can also add another Active Directory server, so ISE can support more than one Active Directory connection. When we're done with that, ISE has already gone out and started working on finding endpoints, and when we finish, we can go ahead and take a look at what we found in Context Visibility. Context Visibility is a new feature that we introduced in ISE 2.1, and it is designed to provide a more granular level of detail for the administrator regarding endpoints that ISE has discovered on the network. To walk you through the layout, we first want to start at the top and work our way down. We have these context tabs. Each one of these tabs display information for that specific context. So if I click on endpoint classification, it's really centered around endpoints. If I want to look at authentication information, as we see here, Context Visibility is going to display that information by itself. Moving down, we have interactive pie charts that the administrator can work with. These charts can be clicked upon and then will allow for dynamically updating the layout and information that is seen in Context Visibility. Below that, we have an action bar. This provides the administrator the ability to add or remove endpoints, import or export endpoints, change the authorization of endpoints, etc. If the administrator starts interacting with the pie charts, we also give them breadcrumbs at the very top. So if administrators want to look at just Windows-only devices, the table at the bottom will dynamically update just to show those endpoints that meet that profile. And lastly, we give a table of all the endpoint information that the administrator is looking for. And again, this is dynamically updated depending on the interaction the administrator has with either the context tabs or the pie charts. A closer view of the endpoint classification tab, we can see a number of different things. If we look at the pie charts, we can see information such as endpoint type, like mobile devices, or under endpoint categories, we can look at OS types. Now, keep in mind, under these different charts, we have the ability to change the information. So if we want to look at profile information, we can simply click there. Or if we want to look at OUI or identity group, or under network devices, we can look at type and device name. As we continue to interact with Context Visibility, you can see in this example that I've started to build a breadcrumb trail. What I'm essentially looking for are any mobile devices that are manufactured by Apple that are running the iOS operating system. And as you can see, as I've interacted with the pie charts and Context Visibility, the table of endpoints at the bottom has been dynamically updated just to show me all of Apple mobile devices, which is what I was looking for. If we click on the Network Devices tab at the top, we get a section of Context Visibility that refers to only the network devices that ISE knows about. We have a pie chart that we can interact with. We can look at location, type, or the device name. And if we select a given network device, here in this example, I have a wireless LAN controller selected, we can see the number of endpoints that controller currently knows about. If we click on that number, context visibility will show us all of the endpoint information that's currently associated to that specific wireless LAN controller. A fundamental feature of ISE is network access control. What we're looking at here is trying to identify who is connected to the network and if that person has valid credentials that would allow them to access the network. Once we understand who that person is, we then need to understand what are they allowed to access, which is the authorization piece of it. An employee may have access to protected servers, shared services, or public network, but if we have a contractor that's accessing the network, if they have valid credentials, we don't want them necessarily to have access to our protected servers. So fundamentally, ISE does authentication as well as authorization for users and devices accessing the network. Access control relies on radius, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Whether we need to authenticate and authorize users coming in over a switch port, or they're coming in wirelessly, or if the user's coming in over a VPN concentrator, ISE has the ability to use radius to authenticate as well as authorize those individuals. Cisco ISE supports a bunch of third-party solutions via standard radius, 802.1x, EAP, and VPN protocols, and we have more coming in the future. ISE support for secure access comes in a number of different ways. We can use MAC authentication bypass, we can do 802.1x, or we can do what's called centralized web authentication or local web authentication. ISE can support up to 500,000 concurrent sessions, meaning 500,000 active users on the network at a time with 1.5 million endpoints in the database. ISE can also support up to 100,000 network devices. It can support up to 300,000 internal users and up to 50 distinct AD domain controllers, or 50 different forests. ISE has also the ability to not only leverage an internal certificate authority, but it can also issue certificates on behalf of an enterprise public key infrastructure. ISE also has the ability to interoperate with SAML IDPs such as Oracle, Ping Identity, or Microsoft Azure. Some of these methods include passive identity as well as active identity. When we talk about passive identity, we're talking about MAC authentication bypass, or we're talking about Easy Connect. When we do active identity, we're talking about a Radius 802.1x or web authentication. Some of the authorization options that ISE supports: downloadable or named ACLs, airspace ACLs, VLAN assignment, secure group tags, URL redirection, port configuration, etc. There are 4 types of guest flows for guest services with ISE. There's hotspot, there's self-service with sponsor approval, as well as sponsored guest access. The goal of the hotspot flow is to get the user onto the internet using an AUP, no matter who they are, and then remember them from a specific amount of time. So what the guest user does is associate to the guest network and is immediately redirected to the guest portal. If they agree to the acceptable use policy, the MAC address of the endpoint is stored into the database in ISE, and then they have guest privileges. Once the day is over, we drop the MAC address from the database, and the user no longer has guest network access. The next flow is self-registration. This is a common use case for organizations that would like to provide guest privileges but don't want to have to interact with the guest. It allows them to register themselves, as the name implies. However, we also at the same time want to provide that the information that's entered into the registration process is valid. So the flow looks like this. The guest associates to the guest SSID, gets redirected. They can click on the link at the bottom that says don't have an account. At that point, they go to the next page, which asks for mandatory information. So long as that information is valid, it then gets sent via a text or email to the user's phone. The user can then reassociate to the guest portal and use those credentials and log into the network, and then finally get guest access. Self-registration with sponsor approval is very similar to the previous flow. However, it meets the needs of those customers who don't want the guest process to be completely automated. What it does is users would go ahead and go through the self-registration process like they normally would. However, an email is then sent to the sponsor who was entered into the registration process. That sponsor then gets notified and has the ability to approve the credentials or not. The last guest flow and most basic guest access scenario that we're going to look at is sponsored guest access. Very basic, and it essentially is a guest shows up to the company requesting guest access. Typically, a lobby ambassador would say, okay, just give me some information and I can get your guest credentials printed out. That lobby ambassador will log into the sponsor portal, create the credentials, and then can either print, email, or SMS those credentials to the guest user. ISE supports 4 BYOD use cases: employees onboarding a personal device they have, employees onboarding a corporate device that was issued to them, mobile device management for compliance, and then the employee managing his or her personal device. BYOD with ISE supports a number of methods in which we can get these devices onto the network. We have a wide range of device support, such as Mac OS X, Windows, Apple devices, Android devices. We have a couple of different ways to allow those devices to get provisioned. We can work with native supplicants. We can use an internal certificate authority or external certificate authority. And we can also leverage different MDM managers such as Mobile Iron or AirWatch or Cisco Meraki to provide compliance information about those devices. The method in which we provision BYOD devices is twofold. The first is the single SSID use case. What happens in a single SSID use case, a user connects to the protected network using a username or password. ISE then detects the fact that the end user is using Active Directory credentials in the form of username or password, and then the endpoint gets redirected to the provisioning portal. It's at that point that ISE pushes a certificate down to the endpoint and as well as a supplicant configuration. Once that has been done, ISE issues a COA, and the endpoint then reconnects using EAP-TLS. The second BYOD use case is using dual SSIDs. It's similar but slightly different. Customers can leverage a dedicated open SSID or use the guest network to provision employee endpoints for BYOD use cases. What happens is the user connects to the open SSID and is then redirected to the WebAuth portal. Once they enter their username and password, ISE detects that they're an employee trying to register a BYOD device and then starts them through the native supplicant provision process. At that point, the employee registers a device in the system, downloads the certificate as well as the supplicant configuration, and then they can then reconnect to the protected network using EAP-TLS. Customers that have compliance requirements for mobile devices can leverage Cisco Meraki, AirWatch, Mobile Iron, a number of different MDM vendors integrate with ISE today. Some of the things that ISE can use for compliance checks are the device registration status, compliance status. We can look at disk encryption status. We can ensure that there's a pin lock on it. We can see if the device has been jailbroken or rooted. We can give you a number of information about the device, including the manufacturer, the serial number, and the phone number of the endpoint, if possible. So the way that this posture compliance assessment for mobile devices works is the endpoint registers with ISE. You can have them go through the BYOD flow if you wish, and then after that, you can have them register with the MDM, and once the compliance information has been checked and the MDM solution states that the endpoint is within the compliance regulations for the organization, then we can allow them corporate access to the network. Lastly, Cisco ISE provides a My Devices portal for customers to allow their employees to self-manage their registered devices. The employee will go to a URL such as mydevices.cisco.com and enter their credentials. Once they sign in, they'll get taken to a page that shows a list of all the devices they have registered in the system. If they click on one of those devices, they can get status information about that device, as well as mark that device as lost, stolen. They can delete it from the system, or they could edit the information about the device. Threat-Centric NAC, or TCNAC, is a feature that was introduced in ISE 2.1. And what it does is it combats the problem of endpoints that are infected with malware, connecting to the network, spreading that malware, and then potentially extracting data off the endpoint. To combat this issue, we developed a solution called Threat-Centric NAC. An endpoint that has a piece of software such as Cisco AMP installed, then reports the fact that the endpoint has been deemed a threat, and once that endpoint tries to connect to the network, ISE downloads the indication of compromise and then has the ability to quarantine that endpoint. Alternatively, we can use a vulnerability scanner such as Qualys. Qualys scans the endpoint and detects that the host is vulnerable. Once the host tries to connect to the network, ISE then downloads the CVSS score and then is able to quarantine and remediate that endpoint. Starting with ISE 2.2, you have the ability to select from a number of different vulnerability assessment vendors. We initially introduced support for Qualys. However, with ISE 2.2, we introduced support for Rapid7 as well as Tenable. Cisco ISE also interoperates with Cisco Cognitive Threat Analytics using the STIX protocol. Cisco ISE also gives you the ability to see vulnerability information inside context visibility, whether we're using Cognitive Threat Analytics, Tenable Nessus, Rapid7, or Qualys. Cisco ISE, through context visibility, gives you or the administrator the ability to look at the threat and impact level of vulnerable endpoints on the network. To wrap up the section on TCNAC, I want to give you an example of vulnerability-based access control. So what we have here is an endpoint connecting to the network. The network access device then sends the access request to Cisco ISE. ISE then issues a limited authorization to include a VA scan. Once that information is received from ISE, ISE can then go to Qualys and request a scan for the endpoint. This Qualys scanner then scans the endpoint for vulnerabilities. Once that information has been received to Qualys, Qualys then sends a report of the CVSS score to ISE. Now, depending on the policy, ISE can send a COA to the network access device. Depending on the posture status or the compliance status of that endpoint, we can either give that endpoint full access or we can quarantine that endpoint. The last security use case I want to talk about is rapid threat containment, or RTC. The problem that we see with customer networks is infection can spread with a really long time before we can detect that there is a problem in the network. So what happens is a employee will download a malicious piece of software on the network, and then this software will then spread throughout the network. All the while, employees are doing their day-to-day jobs. They're interacting with each other, they're interacting with company resources, things of that nature. Now, once this endpoint with the infection on it has collected enough information, it's going to zip all of this information up and then exfiltrate that data out over the internet to a hacker, and then it can be monetized. And what we've seen is that this process, before it's detected, can take anywhere from 100 to 200 days. The solution that Cisco's developed with Firesite Management Center and ISE is we see an endpoint download a malicious piece of software, and whether we're using AMP, our next-gen IPS, or ASA with Firepower services, Firesite Manager within minutes detects that there is an issue with this endpoint, and then over PXGrid, it can tell ISE to quarantine that endpoint, which takes the detection time down from 1 to 200 days to minutes. At the core of this technology is what we call Cisco Platform Exchange Grid, or PXGrid. Now, what this does is it allows ISE, who is able to collect context data such as who, what, when, where, and how, send that to the PXGrid controller, and then is allowed to disseminate that information to Cisco solutions or our ecosystem partners. In the example I just gave you, Firesite Management Center can leverage PXGrid to quarantine an endpoint that shows an indication of compromise. To understand ISE designs for various use cases of customer deployments, we first need to understand the node types that are contained in an ISE deployment. We have the policy service node, which is the heart of an ISE deployment. It makes policy decisions. It essentially is the radius server and provides endpoint and user services. The policy administration node provides an interface to configure security policies for the customer and acts as a replication hub for database configuration changes. The MNT, or monitoring and troubleshooting node, is an interface for reporting as well as logging. It also provides the primary admin node with information regarding the session directory, etc. And lastly, we have the PX Grid controller. This controller facilitates the sharing of context data for our PX Grid ecosystem partners. Now keep in mind, all of these personas have the ability to run on a single host. If we have all of these personas running on a single host, we have what's called a standalone deployment. At minimum, a standalone deployment will have a primary admin node persona, the M&T persona, and a PSN persona. The PX Grid controller is not required. Now, depending on the platform size, we have some scalability numbers that we need to keep in mind. The smallest appliance that we offer is the 3415, which can support up to 5,000 endpoints, and our largest appliance, which is the 3595, can support up to 20,000 active endpoints. If we would like to add redundancy to our standalone deployment, we can develop what's called a basic two-node deployment. Keep in mind that the maximum amount of endpoints, even though we've doubled the deployment size, can go no larger than 20,000 active endpoints, and that's with the 3595 appliance. So in a basic two-node deployment, we have two nodes running admin functionality, M&T functionality, PSN functionality, and then optionally PX Grid controller functionality. If we'd like to add further redundancy to our deployment, we can start distributing personas into dedicated appliances. So what that means is I'm now starting to put personas on a specific appliance, and no personas are sharing that compute resource. In this example here, we have two nodes that are running PAN and M&T functionality, and it's key that we understand that those two personas here are sharing one physical or virtual appliance. In this configuration, we can have a maximum of 5 policy service nodes. Depending on the platform that we've selected or the virtual machine equivalent, we can go no larger than 20,000 active endpoints, and that's if we're using the 3595 appliance. A common misconception about this distributed deployment is that if we continue to add more PSNs to this distributed deployment, I'm able to increase the amount of supported active endpoints. This is a false understanding of this deployment, and the reason being is because the two nodes at the top here are sharing compute resources, specifically the M&T node, which is I/O intensive. This deployment is limited to 5 PSNs and no more than 20,000 active endpoints. If we need to scale beyond 20,000 active endpoints and have complete and maximum redundancy for our ISE deployment, we need to dedicate personas to their own physical or virtual appliance. In a fully distributed deployment, PAN functionality, M&T functionality, and PSN functionality all have dedicated compute resources. Now, if we're using the 3400 series, or specifically the 3495 as PAN and M&T, we have a maximum of 40 PSNs. In that configuration, we can support up to 250,000 active endpoints. If we use the largest appliance as the PAN and M&T and PSN, we can support 50 PSNs in a nice distributed deployment and support up to 500,000 active endpoints. So here I have a single slide overview of scaling by deployment, platform, and persona. From left to right, we have the PAN, M&T, PSN, PX Grid controller running on one. Okay, maximum 2 nodes in this deployment and no more than 20,000 active endpoints, and that's if we're using the 3595. Although we're adding redundancy in the PAN and M&T and breaking out the PSN functionality, we still can't scale beyond 20,000, even though we have a maximum of 5 policy service nodes in this deployment. If we need to go beyond 20,000 active endpoints, we need to start talking about fully distributed deployments. This is by far the more, flexible way to deploy ISE in customer networks, because if you break out PAN, break out MNT, and then break out PSN, you have the maximum amount of redundancy in the customer deployment, and at the same time, you can just add PSNs to fit the number of active endpoints that the customer needs to support in their environment. The last topic I'd like to talk about in terms of sizing is policy service node sizing. Now, depending on the appliance you select, it's going to dictate the amount of endpoints that appliance can support. The 3415 can support 5,000. The larger version of the 3400 series can support 20,000. When we get into the 3500 series appliances, the 3515 can support 7,500, and the 3595 can support up to 40,000 active endpoints at a time. Now, your virtual machines, in terms of best practice, are modeled after our physical appliances. So virtual machines can be configured to scale anywhere from 5,000 to 40,000 active endpoints. If you're going to manually create your virtual machine after our physical appliances, here are the specifications for the 3415, the 3495, as well as the new 3500 series, the 15 and the 95. So take note that the 3500 series are really designed for newer versions of ISE and larger deployments. If you don't want to manually create virtual machine templates in your VMware or your virtual environment, we do provide OVA templates. So these can be downloaded from cisco.com and contain resource reservations already included in the template. So we take the guesswork out of deploying ISE for you. The one thing I do want to point out is the mini OVA template here at the top. This mini OVA template is really designed for lab use only. It supports up to 100 endpoints. It doesn't have any reservations, but it's really not meant for production deployment. So if you need, or if you have a virtual environment in a lab type of setting, then your mini OVA is what you want to use. I'd like to wrap up this session on ISE design concepts by talking about advanced services. ISE has not been an ATP solution for some time now. However, we at the BU do, as a best practice, recommend customers leverage the expertise of a well-trained partner or Cisco Advanced Services. Here I have a advanced service product offered by Cisco called ISE Design Service. It's a six-week effort or 6-week engagement. And what this does is it provides, advanced services will go out, provide a high-level and low-level design document that will be meeting the customer's design guides and goals. So this service will allow advanced services to work with the customer on an ISE design that will go up to 20,000 users on ISE. Again, not required, but something that we do recommend as a best practice. The other product I want to make you aware of is the ISE Design Plus POC service. So like the name implies, what this does is advanced services will come in and do the same things that they would in an ISE design effort, right? So this one's 2 weeks longer. However, what it will also do is provide the customer with a proof of concept. They'll set up one switch, one wireless LAN controller, or a gateway. It'll define up to 5 device profiles, posture policies, and up to 20 test cases or use cases for the customer. If all goes well and the customer's happy with the proof of concept, they can immediately move into the design and the deployment phase of the customer's deployment.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pushya, and I am a product manager with Cisco Identity Services Engine. This tutorial is on licensing and BOM. The agenda of this tutorial has 3 items. First, we'll go through a brief overview of the ISE licenses. Second, we'll look at quoting using the BOM tool. And third, we'll be looking at the handling of older license types. At the end of this module, we will be able to determine the information that is required to build a BOM for the customer, use the BOM tool for ISE to create an ISE quote, export the ISE quote into a file and to CCW, and finally, we'll be able to name the common older license types and suggest next steps to the customer. Here's a broad overview of the ISE licenses. At the bottom of this depiction, you can see the base license. That is where the deployment starts. And based on the requirements of the customer, any of the other licenses can be deployed on top of this. So for example, the customer is interested in TACX Plus capabilities. Then they would be purchasing a device admin license to deploy. If they're interested in BYOD, or profiling plus license would be required. And if they're interested in MDM or compliance, they would be looking at the Apex licenses. ISE Apex provides posture capabilities to the customer's environment. So if they choose to use this, they would be required to purchase AnyConnect Apex as well, which acts as the unified posture agent. So we've seen the license types of ISE. Now, what do we need to generate a quote for the customer? There are 3 steps to this. The first is to estimate the number of concurrent endpoints that are connected in the customer's network. In order to get there, we can look at the devices that are connected to the network at the same time, or we could look at the devices per employee that are connected into the network and look at the total number of employees connected at any given time. In the second step, we have the estimation of the number of hardware appliances or VM appliances needed for the deployment. Now, this deployment can be either centrally located, distributed, or a combination of the two. The third step is about determining the license that is required on the customer's environment. This is based on the kinds of features they are interested in. With this information, we can go into the ISE BOM tool. So this is the home page for the Cisco BOM tool for ISE and AnyConnect. You can see that a Cisco ID is required to log in. Once you log in, you can see the bottom screen here that shows a Create New button. To create a new BOM, I click on the Create New button and I get this pop-up. It is recommended that you go through the details provided in this pop-up. It provides you information on how the tool can help you and how the BOM is calculated. On the right-hand side of this pop-up, you can see the quote type. Right now, we're checking on the ISE quote and clicking OK. Once you click on OK, you'll be taken to this screen where you can provide all the inputs in order to get to the BOM. Let's try to create a BOM now. On this screen, you can see I've provided some inputs. On the left-hand side, I've given the customer name, the total number of sessions, ISE appliance type. The default is physical, and I've left it as it is. The same goes with high availability. The default is yes. And the custom configuration mode, the default is no, and I've left it as is. If the customer has specific requirements as to how many sessions they'd like to run on each node, they can set the custom configuration mode to a yes and provide inputs accordingly. On the right-hand side, you'll notice that the total number of sessions has been populated into base, plus, and apex. Now, AnyConnect Apex measures by the number of end users, and so I have placed a different number here. It is important to note that sometimes, based on the customer's deployment, the ISE Apex number could be the same as AnyConnect Apex. Sometimes it could be lower, and sometimes it could be higher. So it is important to find out exactly what the customer scenario is. And after that, you have device admin and IPsec, which I've left as yes. And with this, we click Make BOM. Here you can see the calculated BOM, which shows all the line items that are associated with your inputs and the prices accordingly. On the top left corner, you can see an export button that gives you a .csv file, which you can view in a spreadsheet. So once I click the export button, I can download the file, which I see at the bottom left of this page. You also have the option to export this file and import it into CCW to create a new estimate instantly. But before we get there, let me point out what's on the bottom right of this page. This is a link to Cisco Service Finder, where you can find the services associated with each of the line items on this page. Now, these services can be added as per the customer's requirement to the CCW estimate later on. All right, so how do we use this BOM that we've created in a CCW estimate? You can see that we have already exported the file and I have the file downloaded on my computer. Now, let me go to CCW and create a new estimate. Under the new estimate, I have a button called Actions on the right side. Under Actions, I have Import Saved Configuration. This gives me the option to select a BOM upload. Once I select here, I can browse for the file and upload the file. And there you have it. As soon as I upload it, I can see all the line items show up in my new estimate. So you've seen how you can create a BOM on the ISE BOM tool and use it on the CCW estimate. Now let's take a look at the common older license types that the customer's environment might have and how we'd suggest next steps to them. One common case we see is advanced licenses. As you can see in the picture on your right, the advanced license features are now distributed between Plus and Apex licenses. So if your customer is up for renewal on advanced licenses, it would be good to understand whether they're using Plus features or Apex features and get the appropriate license. And if there's no change to the deployment, then the number of sessions they've been using for advanced licenses would follow for their Plus license and the Apex license. Now, the same thing can be considered for term as well. It would be good to understand, though, if this time the number of sessions they require has increased or they'd like a different term duration. One exception to this situation is the ISE 1.2 release. This release can take only advanced licenses, so a customer on ISE 1.2 at the time of renewal would still need advanced licenses. It is also important to note that this release 1.2 has been end of software maintenance since May 2017, so it is recommended that the customer upgrade to a supported release. Another common scenario is where the customer has wireless or mobility ISE licenses. So if this customer would like to have their ISE deployment available for wired devices as well, then they are required to purchase mobility upgrade licenses of the same quantity, and these can be co-termed. Now, if the customer wanted to expand their deployment, there are two steps to that. First is the same as the previous one, where mobility upgrade licenses are required, same quantity and co-termed. The second step is to purchase the required number of base, plus, and Apex licenses. Now you know the common older license types we see on our customers' deployments and how to help them renew or expand on their deployment. Please do check out the BOM tool, the content we have on Sales Connect, and the deployment guides. We've reached the end of the module, and now you're able to determine the information required to build a BOM for the customer, use the ISE BOM tool to create an ISE code, export this code to a file and to CCW, and finally, name the common older license types and suggest next steps to your customer. Thank you.